Good evening, everybody. I'm supposed to stand here. First of all, I'm very glad to be I've been invited give this lecture, and I'm standing in rather August environment with the shadows of the greats of my profession. And I'm very excited to give this lecture, and I hope I can convey to you some of the excitement of our work on the Philistines and the major changes that the field is going through in the last few years. And as you can see, one of the things that we try to do when we're excavating is have a lot of fun. Okay. Now, let's start with the basic question. Who are the Philistines? Well, the main source that for knowledge about the Philistines for many years was the biblical text. And of course, if you read the biblical text, particularly in the period before the Israelite monarchy and the earlier stages of the Israelite monarchy, the Philistines play a major role. And of course, they're well known, for example, the story of Samson and Delilah, David and Goliath, and other examples. And mostly when we think about the Philistines, we think of them as the arch enemies of Israel. For about last century, a little more, archaeological excavations in the southern coastal plain of Israel, what we would call in biblical geography Philistia, have uncovered a lot of evidence about the Philistines. And for quite a long time, based on reading the biblical text, based on the reading of Egyptian sources, which we'll talk about a little later on, and the archaeological evidence, there's been a rather monolithic understanding of what went on with the Philistines, that they came as a unified group from somewhere. We'll talk about this somewhere in a moment. And they landed in Canaan, in the land of Israel, took over an area, and lived there for 600 years, and at some stage assimilated and disappeared. And that's more or less the story that has been told for many years in both the research and in the popular discussions of the Philistines. And the truth is, it's time for a paradigm shift. And the reason why we should have to start talking about this is that over the last few decades, and in particular over the last 10, 15 years, there's been a lot of new finds, a lot of new interpretive directions, and a reassessment of a lot of long-held assumptions. And this evening, I'm going to try to talk to you about some of these finds, some of these new interpretations, some of the new methods we're using, and how this affects our understanding of the Philistines, and through that also our understanding of their relations with the Israelites, the Judites, and the Israelites and Judites in general. And I'll be basing it mainly on the finds from Tel Safigat, but every once in a while I'll mention another less important site. Now, so let's give a little background on the Philistines. Just after 1200 BCE, what we would call in archaeological terms the end of the Late Bronze Age and the beginning of the Iron Age, a lot goes on. And basically what happens is the world order, as was known for about 500 years, or 400 years, in the Eastern Mediterranean, where there were big empires, such as in Egypt, such as in the Hittite Empire in modern-day Turkey, in Babylon, in Assyria, the city-states in the area of Canaan, Syria, Israel, and Lebanon, the very, very important cultures in ancient Greece, the Mycenaean culture. All this basically, over a period of about a century, comes apart. And empires fall, city-states are destroyed, peoples move, and the picture changes very drastically. And I always like using this an analogy is, I don't know if Gil will agree with me, but I look at myself as I'm a time traveler. And if we would go into the time tunnel and come out at 1300 BCE, look around, go back into the time tunnel and come out again at 1100 BCE, everything would have been changed. And it's those 150, 200 years which are a fascinating period in history, And by the way, there's an excellent book, and I don't get any percentage on it. It's being sold outside 1187 BCE on exactly this this process. And this is where the Philistines appear, at this cusp of the collapse of the late Bronze Age civilization. And one of the first and foremost pieces of evidence that we have, which is an Oriental Institute excavation, is the excavations of the mortuary temple of Ramses III, the king of Egypt, who ruled in Egypt in the beginning of the 12th century BCE. And in this mortuary temple, on the walls, there's various depictions of things that either actually happened or Ramses III wanted us to believe happened. And among other things, there's a depiction of a land and a sea battle. That's the land battle and that's the sea battle between the Egyptians and groups which are commonly called the Sea Peoples. And among the Sea Peoples, there's one of the groups are the Philistines. And in this depiction, and if we can understand what's going on, there are peoples who are coming from outside of the Levant and settling and trying to capture areas under Egyptian control, and eventually, based on other Egyptian texts, are settled down in the southern Levant, somewhere modern-day Israel. And for many years, this has been the iconic explanation. Groups who came from somewhere in a unified military campaign and forcefully settled down somewhere in ancient Canaan. And while this is still there, and we can't deny this, we have to look at this, and we'll see this soon, in a very different manner. And when we look at where these people are coming from, so most often, Mycenaean Greece is seen as the region from which the Philistines came from. Once in a while, somebody will say, maybe they came from from Western Anatolia, and then you'll have somebody say, no, they came from Cilicia, and then there's another person say, no, they all came from Cyprus, and then once in a while somebody will go, actually maybe they came from the Balkans. And for years, people have been looking for the Ur Heimat, the Alt Philistia, the original home of the Philistines, and hoping that one day we'll be able to identify where these people came from. And I'll give you a hint of where we're going. It probably is that they came from many places and not from one place. And so when we look at the Philistines and their cultural backgrounds, we have to take into account a region, maybe going back to Sardinia, of very mixed cultural origins and various groups coming together and settling along the southern coastal plain of modern-day Israel. Now, here's where archaeology of Levant comes in. When we start looking at the area of the southern coastal plain, or as we said, Philistia, and in sites which are occupied during the late Bronze Age and the Iron Age, we can see very clearly a distinct change in the material culture. We can see that somewhere right after 1200 BCE, new pottery types appear. And these pottery types are very similar to pottery that we see at the same time in Greece, in the Mycenaean culture, or in Cyprus, or in southern or western Turkey. We see new types of architecture that appears, which is very reminiscent of architecture we see in these western areas. We see new types of cooking apparatus. For example, one of the things that we'll talk about this soon is that the Philistines cook in a round fireplace, or it's not a fireplace, you would call it a campfire or something of the sort, and a hearth. And these are things that we didn't see in Canaan beforehand. So this clearly indicates that something new is going on. And when we fit this in with the Egyptian evidence, the biblical evidence, this fits in very well with our picture of the Philistines as this group coming from outside the country, settling down, carving a region of the southern coastal plain, Philistia, and settling just opposite this very noisy group that was settled just at the same time in the highlands, the Israelites. Because just after 1200, this is when we have the very early first evidence of the formation of the Israelite tribes in the region which we would call today the West Bank or Judea and Samaria, call it whatever you want to, or the Central Hills in a less politicized geographical jargon. And they sit right opposite the Philistines. And when you look at the map, what you basically have is the Philistines over here, the Israelites over here, and when they're strong, they push eastwards, and when they're strong, they push westwards, and there's this back and forth seesaw between the two groups throughout the Iron Age. And this is reflected in the biblical text as well, and we'll talk about this soon. And it's clearly fits in with why the Philistines play a role in the biblical text. Because the people who wrote the biblical text, their roots are here. If the people who wrote the biblical text were over here, we would have heard about another group of sea peoples. The fact that we're hearing about the sea peoples is because they were facing the Israelites during the Iron Age. Now, as I said, usually it was thought the Philistines were from the Mycenaean culture. They arrive in Canaan and conquer the Canaanite cities in Philistia on the southern coastal plain and replace the Canaanites. And subsequently, there's a slow process of acculturation, assimilation with neighboring cultures. So after 500, 600 years, if you go to Philistia, they've lost their foreignness. They've become Levantanized completely. And another important point is based on the biblical text. According to the biblical text, from about the 10th century, the time of the so-called United Kingdom, the time of David and Solomon, the Israelite kingdom and subsequently the Judite kingdom are stronger than the Philistines. And according to the biblical text, David captures Philistia and takes over Philistia. But as we'll see, that's far from the case when we start looking at the evidence. So now let's start looking at Tel Assaf-Gat. Here we have the southern coastal plain, Philistia, with the 5 major cities of the Philistines: Ashdod, Ashkelon, Gaza, Ekron, and Gat over here. And you can see here Tel Assaf, which is located just on the border between the coastal plain and the foothills, the Judean foothills, which we call in Hebrew the Shphelah. And the Shphelah is the border zone between the coastal plain and the central hills. And most of the biblical texts that deal with the interaction between the Philistines and the Israelites occur in this Shphelah zone. Why? Because it's an interaction zone, and that's where they meet. Now, if you go to the biblical text and count the number of times the various Philistine cities are mentioned, Gat is mentioned more than all the others. And believe me, I counted. And the reason for this, most probably, is that Gat is the closest of the Philistine cities to the Shphelah and to the Judean zones. So probably a lot of the interaction between the Israelites and the Philistines, at least in the earlier part of the Iron Age, occurred at this site, and this is perhaps reflected in the biblical text as well. Now, let's look at a quick view. Here you can see a view from east to west towards the coast, Ashkelon and Gaza. That's the northern Sinai. That's the area of let's say, El Arish nowadays, the border between the Gaza Strip and Egypt. And here you can see the coastal plain Philistia with Gat right on the border with the beginning of the Judean Shphelah, the Judean foothills leading westwards. And this is the Elah Valley. And for those of you familiar with the biblical text, the story of David and Goliath, of course, occurs somewhere between Socho, which is located over here, and Azekah, which is located over here, and somewhere over here, at least according to the biblical text, that's where this battle occurred. And when David knocked off Goliath's head, the Philistines run in the valley towards Gat and Ekron, which is right to the north. So we're dealing here right on the border between these two zones. Now, Gat has always been an interesting place. And from the very beginning of the archaeological research in Israel, people have been trying to find where Gat is. Now, what makes it a bit problematic is that there is no site in the ancient Philistia called Gat or something like Gat, as opposed to Ashkelon, which still today is called Ashkelon, or Gaza is still called Gaza, or Ashdod, or Jerusalem is called Jerusalem. There's no place called Gat. So over the last century, there have been a few suggestions about where Gat is located. Now, nowadays, I think we can say quite clearly, although we haven't yet found the sign "Welcome to Gat," the finds that we have, both archaeological and from an analysis of the texts that are available, it seems quite clear that Tel Safi is located here. But as someone said when I showed this slide, I should show a slide of the few sites in this region that weren't suggested as Gat. But this is an interesting point because it took many years to reach a scholarly consensus that, in fact, the site of Tel Safi is Gat, but I think that issue is down. Now here you can see views of the site. It's a very large site, and one of the interesting features of the site is this white cliff, these white chalk cliffs that are on the northwestern side of the site, and this is, in fact, gives the site its Arabic name. Tel Safi, Safi in Arabic means something like pure, something like of the sort, and various places where there are geographical features that are white in Arabic is called Isafi. And so this is the name of the site, and as you can see, Isafi has nothing to do with Gat, so it took us a while to reach this identification. Now, here's the site in a picture taken in the 1920s during the British Mandate of Palestine, and you can see here that the site, the upper mound is covered by a village, the village of Tel Safi. And below it, you can see most of the site is unsettled. Now, in 1899, two British explorers, Bliss and McAllister, excavated on the site for 2 weeks. And very fortunate for us, they didn't get along with the local villagers, and they left after 2 weeks because everywhere else these two people excavated, they basically destroyed the sites and reported very poorly. So the fact that they left the site enabled us to excavate extensively. Now, when we reached the site in 1997, one of the major problems is that big parts of the upper Tel, that's this horseshoe-shaped hill that you see over here, were covered by the remains of this modern Palestinian village, which was abandoned in 1948 during the Israeli War of Independence, and the graveyards which are associated with it. And so basically, large parts of the upper Tel were inaccessible. And this, in fact, is the reason why since 1899 till 1997, when we started excavating, nobody excavated the site. But after we conducted a surface survey, it turned out that there were major parts of the site where we could get to the earlier Bronze and Iron Age remains and not have to go through the later medieval and modern remains. And basically, since then, we've been following the areas where we can get to the earlier remains and not have to dig through the later layers. Now here's an aerial photograph and a general plan of the site, and just to give you an idea of some of the areas that we're working on, just to give a concept, that's 100 meters, about 100 yards, so you can see it's a very large site, and we're excavating in various excavation areas on the eastern side of the Tel, on the summit, in the lower city, a burial zone, and the siege system, which we'll talk about soon, and I'll return to these areas as we move along. Now, as in many ancient Middle Eastern sites, as Gil mentioned beforehand, it's a stratified, multi-period site, one culture above the other, one culture of the other, and I don't want to get into the details, but it goes from the early Bronze Age all the way to the modern period. And we're going to be focusing in this lecture only on part of the story, the Iron Age, from about 1200 to about 586. This is the period which, if you take it into biblical terms, this is the period from the appearance of the Israelites in Canaan until the destruction of the first temple. and it's in archaeological terms called the Iron Age, the Philistines appearing here, and slowly the Iron Age develops, and the end of the Iron Age, at least from a historical point of view, in this region is marked by the Babylonian campaigns in which, among other things, they destroyed Jerusalem in 586. Now, we start looking at the finds, and we can start seeing all kinds of very typical pottery that appears when the Philistines first appeared that are completely non-local. And this goes for cooking vessels, serving vessels, and a whole slew of other objects. We see very interesting cultic objects. For example, this fascinating chalice, which has on it these decorated bird heads, and it's painted as well, along with other vessels of local and non-local origins. And all this shows us that all kinds of new cultural attributes are appearing in this culture at the time, indicating that there is a lot of new non-local influences in Philistia at the time. And perhaps the best known of the Philistine culture is the Philistine bichrome ware, which you can see examples here. And this is a piece of bichrome pottery that we found just this summer at Tel Safi. And one of the iconic attributes of the bichrome pottery are these beautiful birds. Yesterday I gave a lecture at University of Kansas, and the mascot of the basketball team is the Jayhawk. So they like the bird very much. But I don't know what the mascot of the what is it, a pizza of the yeah. Anyway, so now another very interesting thing is that we know very little about the Philistines and how they buried themselves. I mean, they didn't bury themselves, they buried the Philistines. What we do know is that the Philistines died. And what's a very interesting aspect is that in all the major Philistine sites, we don't have any recognized formal cemeteries. Now, this is a very interesting question. Is it because we haven't looked enough? Is it because the Philistines didn't bury their dead, threw them out in the fields? Or perhaps they buried them, they cremated them and spread the ashes, or they threw them out in the sea? We don't know, but we really don't have a lot of evidence. And so one of the things that we've been doing a lot is walking around the site on a very wide area to try to find areas which we might identify burials. And in fact, in this valley, we came upon about 20 to 30 cave openings, which we decided to excavate one of them. And here you can see the excavation of this tomb. You know, I'm playing a Philistine here. And what we had here is a very interesting thing, both from an archaeological point of view, but from also a modern point of view, is that this tomb and the tombs around it had been looted by a Bedouin who lives 200 meters from this excavation. And when we were excavating this tomb, he came over and says, "Oh yeah, I dug that 10 years ago," and then he was very disappointed because we started finding things, and it turns out that they had taken the things out of the tomb, and at some stage part of the roof collapsed, so they left the tomb. And they had thought they had excavated the entire contents of the tomb, and in fact, though, we were fortunate they left us some of the objects, and it gives us a nice view of what the Philistines put in their tombs at the time. Unfortunately, because it was looted, we couldn't see how they actually buried the skeletons, buried the people. But what was very interesting when we studied the bones, it turns out that these people were extremely unhealthy, had a horrendous diet, and perhaps like most people in antiquity, lived a very short and extremely painful life. And this is very important to remember, is that life in antiquity was very, very different from life that we know it today. And I think it's true for the Philistines, it's true for anybody you go in ancient times. Now, another very interesting thing is starting to look at the Philistine diet. Now, how do we look at the Philistine diet? We look at the Philistine diet based on the archaeological remains. And we can see now from an analysis of animal bones is that when the Philistines appear in Canaan, at many, but not all, of the Philistine sites, we can see that there is a consistent use of pig and dog in their diet. And as opposed to the Canaanites, and in most cases the Israelites, you don't have use of pig. Now, it's not clear-cut. I mean, in the past, it's been suggested if you find pig bones, it's a Philistine site. If you don't find pig bones, it's an Israelite site. It's more complex than that. But nevertheless, there is some sort of a general trend. And by the way, the lack of the fact that the Israelites abstained, or maybe the Judahites abstained from eating pig, perhaps is the earliest evidence of the initial stages of what afterwards becomes the Jewish dietary laws, the kashrut laws. At this stage, it's very different from the what we know today, but I'll wake you up for a second. I'll tell you a joke. Moses on Mount Sinai, and God says to him, "Thou shalt not boil a kid in his mother's milk." So Moses says, "So that means we have to separate between milk and meat dishes?" He says, No. Thou shalt not boil a kid in his milk. Oh, so we have to wait 6 hours between meat and milk? No, that means thou shalt not boil a kid in his boiled meat. So that means that we also can't eat chicken and milk? Oh, do whatever you want to. Anyway, so Now, one of the interesting things that we moved ahead with is we started analyzing the ancient DNA of the pig bones. And it turned out that we can identify, based on the DNA of the pig bones found in the land of Israel from the Middle Bronze Age until the Roman period, that at a very specific point in time, in the beginning of the Iron Age, there's an influx of European pig DNA. And believe it or not, they can differentiate between European and Levantine pig DNA. And what this indicates is that when the Philistines came, they brought with them, whether on their ships or in their carts, squealing pigs. And these pigs settled and eventually dominated the local pig genome and took over from the local Levantines. So this is a very interesting microscopic way of showing the actual Philistine presence and what happened when they arrived. The same thing can be said about plant use. There are unique types of plants which appear first when the Philistines arrive, and also we can see different types of plant use. I mean, they use plants in a different way from the locals, and again, this indicates from where they're coming, and again, it points out towards the western and northwestern Mediterranean. Now, as I said before, it's not only the food, but how they cook the food. And when we look at the ways they cook, whether it's on the hearths, which we know are connected, and we see these things in Cyprus, or when the early Philistines arrive, we see suddenly the appearance of closed cooking jugs, as opposed to the Canaanites and the Israelites, who cooked in large open cooking vessels. The Philistines cooked their food in closed ones. Now, why does this happen? Because wherever the Philistines came from, they came with their own cooking traditions. And as we know, who you are is what you eat. And people want to eat their cultural foods. And so if imagine a guy from Athens comes, he wants to have souvlaki. He has to make souvlaki in a vessel that you make souvlaki. And you can't make souvlaki in a vessel that you cook Canaanite stew in. So that's why we have these things appearing. And we've tried to study this also on a microscopic level to try to understand what they cooked, what fuel they used, how they put it, where they placed the vessels. And we're starting to get answers in this, but there's still a lot to be done. Another very interesting aspect is when we were excavating one of the Philistine houses, we came upon a plaster floor, which looked like another plaster floor. And then this was analyzed by our archaeological science team in the field, and it turned out this is a type of plaster which we call hydraulic plaster. That means plaster that can harden when it's not in contact with oxygen. And most plaster that's used throughout history is plaster that you put on the wall, and it hardens as it's on the wall. Something that's usually identified as a Roman invention is the plaster that hardens, or cement that hardens underwater. And it turns out that this is a hydraulic plaster, the earliest that we know of in the Levant. And interestingly, when we look at the Minoan and Mycenaean culture, we also see hydraulic plaster. So this is a nice example of a microscopic element in the Philistine culture, which we can discover due to this thing. And this is a good time to talk about one of the things that we do on the site is we have a very, very intensive interdisciplinary and interfield collaboration with people coming from all kinds of different fields of science. We usually have about 20 to 25 different experts working in the field. And as you can see, it's not only taking the objects once we find them and bringing them back to the lab, but actually putting the lab in the field and getting the answers on the spot using infrared spectrometers and a whole slew of other methods that I won't go into here. And this enables us to get very interesting pictures of what we're getting and things that we couldn't have seen in previous years. Now, I want to point out a very interesting find that we found here. This is a building, and here's more or less the reconstructed temple walls. Two very nice column bases, just 2 meters 15, which is about 4 Royal Egyptian cubits. What this means is that this was a well planned out building. Now, add to it 2 columns. What does this remind you of? Samson and the 2 pillars. Now, here, I'll do this, this is, now, on my poster also outside, I don't know if you noticed this, there was Samson knocking down the pillars. Now, what does this tell us? Is there a connection to the biblical story? And this is, I think, this is a good example of where we are now in biblical archaeology as opposed to where we were decades ago. This does not prove the Samson story. This does not mean that the story actually happened or the story happened here. What I think this does tell us, though, is that the person who wrote down, or the persons who wrote down the story, whether the story happened or not, or whether something similar to it, or some tradition of something like that happened, it may very well be that the person who wrote down the story knew what a Philistine temple looked like. So if at all, what we can use this for is to give us a feeling of the cultural realia of the people who wrote the biblical text when the story was first written down in the biblical story. And another example of this is right next to this temple, we found this area, we found remains of metallurgical activity. Now, those who are very familiar with the biblical text, there's a text in the Bible in which it's usually assumed that the Philistines had a monopoly on the metalsmithing. And in fact, archaeologically, we've shown the complete opposite. Early metalsmithing in the Levant, in the Iron Age, is only at Israelite sites. In fact, this is the first Philistine site where we found evidence of archaeological evidence of metalworking. So here you have you flip this, it's a complete flip of the biblical text. Now, another interesting aspect is, what did the Philistines speak? And if they wrote, what did they write? Now, if the Philistines came from Greece, Anatolia, Cyprus, or wherever, these are regions where they didn't speak Semitic languages. Not Hebrew, Canaanite, Phoenician, nothing, different languages. And if we, for example, go to ancient Anatolia, they had Hittite, Luwian, other languages. And if you go to ancient Greece, you had Mycenaean Greece. These are Indo-European languages mostly. So if we're talking about groups of people who came from that region, perhaps they spoke these non-Semitic languages. And there are hints to this, both in the biblical text, names such as Goliath, Achish, and others hint to non-Semitic names and terminology. We have a couple of Philistine inscriptions which mention non-Semitic names and terms. And when we start looking at writing, this is also an interesting axis, because first of all, you can't assume in the ancient world that people wrote. Not everybody wrote. But there were various writing systems in the western areas, such as in the Crete and in Mycenae, like if you perhaps have heard, the Linear A, Linear B, Cypro-Minoan, and other less-known languages. So perhaps these writing scripts and languages were brought to Philistia. Now, that's a tantalizing idea, but unfortunately we have very, very little evidence. And we have a few inscriptions, most of them undeciphered, and one from Tel Safi, which may give us a little hint of what's going on here. And on a shirt, the whole thing is about this size, we found 8 incised signs, which if we turn them into English letters, it would be ALWT, alwat, or something like that, and then a line breaking between the words, and WLT, walat. And from a very extensive analysis, this is probably names which are Indo-European names, non-Semitic names, but written in the local alphabetic script, in the archaic alphabetic script. So perhaps what this tells us is that when this inscription was written, somewhere around the 10th century, the Philistines still retained the use of some of the non-local names that they brought with them, or those that came from outside the region 200 years earlier. But by this time, they had started using the local scripts. And so you have a process of this intermixing, this mingling, this hybridity between the various components of this Philistine culture to what we call an entangled culture. And we can see this very nicely in this inscription. Now, why is it the so-called Goliath inscription? Because for many years, it was an assumption that there was a Lydian king by the name of Alwatis. Lydia in the Iron Age, Turkey, about 8th century BCE, his name was Alwatis, and it was assumed that Goliath is like a form of the name Alwatis. So when we found this, it was first called the Goliath inscription. We've taken this apart, and it's not Goliath, it's not a cereal bowl or anything of the sort, but rather it's 2 names which belong to the same generic linguistic family as Goliath. So we haven't found Goliath's cereal bowl, but what we have found here is very nicely that in 10th century Gat, home of Goliath according to the biblical text, people were named names very similar to Goliath. So again, what does this tell us about the story of David and Goliath? It doesn't prove that the biblical text, that the guy, hit him on the head, cut off his head, but rather it perhaps tells us that, in fact, in the 10th century, there were people with that cultural background, and that cultural background was remembered in the biblical text whenever this story was written down. And even if the story was written down centuries later, they still remembered the existence of these people with this foreign background. Now, a very interesting find, fresh off the press from this season. You can barely see it over here. You can see this little circle coming out. What this is a complete ivory bowl that we excavated out very carefully, and then in the lab, it turned out to be this beautiful elephant ivory bowl, which fantastically, you can see a drawing of it, we found a very great parallel from a very interesting excavation conducted at Megiddo by the Oriental Institute. And in the Oriental Institute excavation, they found a bunch of bowls, including one which, although fragmentary, and I hope to have a chance to look at it tomorrow in the storage rooms, is an exact parallel to this object. So you have here an object which is probably from the 10th century. These are objects from the 12th century. This means that this ivory bowl was so precious that it was kept on a family's mantle for 300, 400 years. And this means also, very interestingly, that objects which were of importance, of cultural significance in the Canaanite culture, continued to play a significant role. They were appropriated and used within the Philistine culture as well. This tells us that perhaps there's a lot more Canaanite aspects in the Philistine culture than perhaps we want to recognize from a simplistic point of view. Now, the next aspect that I want to talk about is the most interesting finds on the site. Wherever we excavated on the site, we found this destruction level, which we date to about the 9th century, the Iron Age 2A, about 830 BCE. And wherever we excavate, we find houses which collapsed with hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of finds, almost a Pompeian-like type of discovery. And archaeologists love the misfortunes of other people, and here we have a prime example. And we have everything under the sun from every aspect of daily life, including these fascinating cultic vessels, which turn out to be meant for incense. And a very interesting result of this, of the analysis of these vessels, is that we could recognize, using a new method called organic residue analysis, the organic molecules sort of soak into the matrix of the pottery, and you can in many cases identify what the contents of these vessels were. And it turns out that incense was burnt in these vessels, and among the components of this incense was cinnamon and nutmeg. Now, cinnamon and nutmeg comes from Sri Lanka. So at 1000 BCE, people in Philistia were trading down the line until they got cinnamon and nutmeg from Sri Lanka. Now, this completely changes how we understand international trade at that time, because for many years it was assumed that Philistia, after the Philistines arrived around 1200 until maybe about 900, they were closed in within Philistia. They sort of lost contact with the outer world. And nowadays, more and more evidence shows us that even though the Philistines were not a robust, active maritime culture, they did have extensive contacts throughout the Mediterranean, and as you see over here, further afield as well. Now, in this destruction level, we found all kinds of houses, and very often we found cultic corners in the houses. And just like if you go to the East, or in Catholic, in South America, you see every house has a cultic corner, a little, a place for the Buddha, or for Maria, or whatever you want. We found similar things in these houses as well. And one of the interesting ones we found in a house where you found plastered niches, then a little stone rectangular object, perhaps an altar, and right on top of it we found a whole collection of objects which had fell down right on top of the altar. And when we looked at the objects, they were a collection of various types of cultic vessels, adorned with animal heads, the shape of a pomegranate. We'll talk about this shape in a moment, and all kinds of other objects. And interestingly enough, many of them had holes for suspension. So what we probably had here is you had a cultic, a hanging, candelabra or something of the sort that was hanging above this altar. And if you look, for example, at various cultic and objects and depictions from various periods, you can see very similar things at the time. Someone suggested that this was baby Goliath's, how do you call a mobile, yeah. So, but I think it's something of cultic nature. Now, and here we come to a very interesting story. In several of these cultic corners, we found these vessels, and to make sure that I wasn't imagining things, I spoke to a couple of urologists to make sure that, in fact, I was seeing what I thought I was seeing. And they agreed upon it. And it turns out that these things have been found at least at another Philistine site. And this connects to a very interesting biblical story. If you're familiar with the story of the ark, that the ark, according to there's a biblical narrative in which the Philistines, the Israelites have this battle at Ebenezer, and the Israelites take the ark to bring it to battle, hoping that the Israelite God will win the battle. He doesn't. You were talking about they have to, they should have fired him immediately. The ark is taken captive, and it's paraded around the various Philistine cities. And it's this whole narrative is a very funny narrative because they're constantly making fun of the Philistines. But wherever the ark comes to, the Philistines are stricken by something which in the biblical text is called ophalim, or tchorim, and it's usually translated as hemorrhoids or swellings. Now, the way that the Philistines help this problem is they make golden hemorrhoids. Now, I never understood how you could make a golden hemorrhoid. I can understand how you could make gold from hemorrhoids, but I never understood the golden hemorrhoids. And then, when we found these objects, this gave me a very interesting insight, perhaps an archaeological way to explain a biblical term that was never understood. What's the idea? Is that the main Philistine deity was actually a goddess. And this was a goddess who was probably connected to a goddess somewhat similar to Gaia, the Greek and Roman Mother Earth or something of the sort. And we know from later Greek and Roman texts that one of the attributes of Gaia and other goddesses such as Cybele was, surprisingly, even though they were female goddesses, phalluses. And so perhaps what you have here is, in fact, that in this biblical narrative, when the Philistines are afflicted in their swellings, what's going on is sort of like a double jab at the Philistines. On the one hand, they're getting at the Philistine goddess because it's the Israelite god against the Philistine goddess. And on the other hand, they're also they're hurting where, they're getting them where it hurts. And so perhaps this might be a nice example of how we can take a completely misunderstood word without any parallel in biblical text, and perhaps based on the archaeological remains, give it an explanation based on the realia of that time. Now, another very important find is we spoke a lot about the Upper Tell, this horseshoe-shaped area. And when we conducted our survey, one of the things that we found is in the lower city, there was a lot of Iron Age pottery. And when we first published our survey, some of my more generous colleagues said, oh, Mayer doesn't understand survey. All the pottery that we found here, this simply, it's fallen off the top of a tell and has nothing to do with a settlement. Now, this is, in volleyball, we call this, when you throw up the ball for a smackdown. When somebody doesn't believe what you did in your survey, what do? You excavate. So we excavated area D, and right below surface, we found remains which show us very clearly that, in fact, this entire area was settled during the 9th century and perhaps earlier as well. And what this means is that the city of Gat was the largest city in the entire land of Israel during the 10th and 9th century, which puts it about 40 to 50 hectares, which is about 5 or 6 times the size, or maybe 8 times the size of Jerusalem at that time. It's twice the size of Ashkelon at that time. There's no other comparable city, which means most probably that Gat was the largest and most important city at the time. And here you can see remains of these finds right below surface, and this is fantastic. We're talking about 2,800-year-old buildings, which are right below surface. You dig 5 centimeters and you're in the buildings. And nothing happened here in the last 2,800 years. And here you can see the remains. And in the upper city, we found these fantastic remains of the destruction. And what turns out to be a very interesting object, this altar, which you see me very happily standing next to it, which was found over there. And this is a very interesting find. Here you have pictures and a drawing of the altar. The altar is, first of all, made out of 1 block of stone. largest monolithic altar that we have found in this region in the Iron Age. And you'll notice that the back and the sides of the altar are in an unfinished state. Only the very front of the altar was finished off. And notice it has these two horns here. It reminds me of Cookie Monster also. And what's special about this altar is that, first of all, its dimensions. It's 50 by 50 by a meter high. That is more or less a cubit by 2 cubits. And there's a very interesting depiction of one of the altars in the tabernacle in Exodus, which gives us an exact same size. Now, this does not mean that we found the altar of the tabernacle, but rather it means that the Israelites and the Philistines had a similar concept of sizes, of dimensions of cultic objects that were used in both cultures. On the other hand, what's very interesting is that we have 2 horns only. And when you look at most of all the other altars that have been found in Philistia and in other regions of the Iron Age Levant, they all have 4 horns. And you can go downstairs, or not go downstairs, go out the door and to the right, and you can see one of the 4-horned altars in the museum here. So something's going on here. And why 2 altars? Why 2 horns? And perhaps this can be explained that we have 2-horned altars coming from the west. So here we have a very nice example of the entangled culture, the connection between the 2 Western and Eastern traditions coming together at the Philistines. Another interesting thing, the altar was found just where this woman is standing, and right next to it we found a room with an enormous collection of loom weights. Now, loom weights tells us that there's weaving going on here, and we know from the biblical text and from other ancient Near Eastern texts, and also from Greek texts, that very often weaving was connected with cult. And so perhaps we have another activity relating to cult. And around the altar, we found all kinds of other cultic objects, very interesting figurine of a dog, a decorated chalice, and a couple of inscriptions. And this inscription is fascinating. It's an inscription which it's something like Avtam or Aviam or something of the sort, which is an Israelite name. It's not a Philistine name. And when we analyze the pottery of this jar is made in Jerusalem, in the area of Jerusalem. So this means that an Israelite wrote his name, or a Judite wrote his name on a jar that was made in Jerusalem, and then sent it to the Philistine temple, which means that the interaction between the Philistines and the Israelites is not only of fighting, but also perhaps even dedicating objects to the gods of your so-called enemies. So something else is going on here. And this is a very interesting way of looking at the additional facets behind life. Now, another interesting aspect that we came upon is that below this red structure with the altar, we started last season and this season discovering an earlier phase. And it turns out that below this 9th century city, we have a substantial lower city dating to the 10th century. The 10th century is the time of David and Solomon. The 10th century is the time of the so-called United Monarchy. The 10th century is the time where, according to the biblical text, David captured Philistia. But if Gat exists in the 10th century and is an enormous city, and there's no evidence of destruction, not in the 11th, not in the 10th, and it's only destroyed in the 9th century, and we'll talk about by who in a second, by Hazael, king of Aram, it means that throughout this entire period, the major city, the major polity, the major kingdom in this region was Gat. And that means that, try as you may, you can't say that the Judite kingdom captured Philistia if God is still standing. And this means that we have to reassess our understanding of the relationship between the Judites and Gat. And it could very well be that it's only after Gat is destroyed in 830 by Hazael, and we'll talk about this in a moment, only then can the Judite kingdom start to expand westwards. So it could very well be that, I'm not saying there wasn't a Judite kingdom in the 10th century, but in the 10th and most of the 9th century, the Judite kingdom was small. It wasn't this enormous kingdom from the Nile to the Euphrates, as depicted in let's say, in a simple reading of the biblical text. And this is just an interesting collection of cultic objects that were found on this level, including a complete seashell of a type which, very interestingly, is used in the Minoan culture as a cultic object. So perhaps we have, again, hints of the continuity of the Western traditions in Philistine culture. Now, who caused the destruction? And I already hinted to this. This is Hazael, the king of Aram Damascus, and it appears in a very short biblical verse in which it says, in half the verse, Hazael, king of Syria, went up and fought against Gat, did that, and then he took it, and Hazael wanted to face Jerusalem, and then the story goes on and tells all about Jerusalem. Now, this is a very good example of the historicity of the biblical text. The biblical text doesn't give a damn about Gat. The biblical text is interested in Jerusalem. So it mentions in half a verse the destruction of the biggest city in the Levant at that time, a destruction which had enormous repercussions for the geopolitical card shuffle after its destruction. But what was interesting to the biblical writer is, oh yes, and afterwards he went to Jerusalem, and Joash, the king of Judah, gave the temple treasures to Hazael. Hazael didn't conquer Jerusalem, and the story goes on. And if it wasn't for this half of a verse, perhaps one of the most important historical events that occurred in the Iron Age, we wouldn't even mention in the biblical text. Now, a fascinating aspect that we can connect to this is that when I came to the site in the beginning of the project, I took some old aerial photographs of the site. Here we have an aerial photograph from 1945 when the Palestinian village was still standing, and I took ones from other periods as well. And one of the things I noticed immediately was this feature that can be seen on the eastern, southern, and western sides. And it's marked off over here, and it turns out what we have here is a siege system. In fact, the earliest siege system discovered archaeologically in the entire world, and it's comprised of a very deep trench that's dug out into the bedrock, and then the material is poured out this way, and it surrounds the site from three sides. And what we know, I'll go back here, is that the reason why they dug it only on three sides is because they utilized the natural riverbed on the northern side as the continuation of the trench, so they didn't have to dig it. And so what we have here is basically a monumental siege system that surrounds the site. Those of you familiar, for example, the Roman circumvallations surrounding Masada or Alega and Gaul, etc. This is a method in which you close the city in so the besieged can't escape, they can't receive supplies and reinforcements, and they can't attack the besieging army. And so they built this enormous thing around the site, and here's an artist's reconstruction of what it might have been. And Hazael waited out and waited out and waited out, and then captured the city, burnt it down, and destroyed the city completely. Now, a very important addition to this is in the early 20th century, in a French excavation in northern Syria, an inscription called the Zakur inscription was found, in which in the 10th line it says that Bir-Hadad, the son of Hazael, came to capture the city in which Zakur was in, and when he came, the forces of Bir-Hadad raised a wall higher than the wall of Hazrael and dug a ditch deeper than its ditch. So perhaps what we have here is a literary mention of the same method of siege that we see on the ground at Gat. Now, the site of Hadrach is identified as a site called Tel Afis in northern Syria, and I've been hoping for years that there would finally be a peace treaty between Israel and Syria. I could visit it and check it out for myself, and it looks like that's not going to happen. So I'll have to wait. Maybe the next generation will check it out, and perhaps we can find the on-the-ground evidence of this also in another site. Now, without going too much into the details, we date this campaign to around 830, both on historical reasons, but also based on carbon-14 dating, and fits in very well with the general picture. And once this occurs, Philistia changes, and Gat ceases to be the major city, and the 4 other cities become more important, and simultaneously the kingdom of Judah starts expanding westwards, and things are very different from this point onwards. And in fact, from this point onwards, Gat is not a major player anymore. Gat does not figure in as a major Philistine city anymore. Now, what we do have after this, there was a very interesting thing. When we excavated in several places on the site, we found that destruction layer, which I mentioned. And in this case, we found lots of brick collapses, bricks that had fallen off walls, and right below it, a thin layer of wind-blown sediment. That means that in between this destruction layer and this brick collapse, there had been a period in which the wind had brought in dust. And just shows you that you have to clean your house from dust, because if not, it eventually gets very deep. And then right above this, we had late 8th century levels. So what we may have here is a human-caused event, the Aramean destruction, abandonment, this brick collapse, which we would like to suggest as an earthquake, and I'll talk about it in detail above it, and it's sandwiched in between 2 late 8th century levels. So if this is late 9th and this is late 8th, this has to be somewhere in between. And it just happens that there is let me show you what I'm talking about. Here you have the foundation of this wall, and we can see that there are 2 forces in working here. One is, first, the wall shifts off the foundation, and then a second force collapses the bricks. Now, this is very well known in seismology, that when an earthquake hits, there are 2 major energy forces. One is horizontal, and it hits first, and a second, which is called the S wave, which is, if you want, a wavy wave, hits a couple of seconds later. And very often what you'll have is the buildings will move, and then the second wave will cause them to collapse. And this is what we apparently have here. Now, the problem is, though, when you have stone architecture which collapses, there are very, very clearly defining aspects that seismologists can identify which tell you it's an earthquake. Once you're dealing with bricks, it's a little more difficult, but since we have long walls in which this occurred, it seems that this is a clear case of earthquake collapse. And this is important because this can be connected to a biblical tradition of a major earthquake that occurred in the mid-8th century, about 760. It's mentioned in the book of Amos, in which, in the first verse of the book, they introduce who this guy Amos is, and it tells us that his prophecy started 2 years before the earthquake. And in the book of Zechariah, which is hundreds of years after this event, there is still a very distinct memory of that. This is sort of like the earthquake when the big fire of Chicago, 1900 something. So this is the what? 1871. Yeah, okay, there you go. I'm good in ancient history, not in modern history. 1871. So, and everybody remembers the big fire of Chicago. So here, for centuries afterwards, they remember this enormous event. And it's not only in Jerusalem. This event apparently was so significant that the seismic forces knocked down buildings all the way in Philistia, which is much farther from the epicenter, which would be somewhere in the Jordan Valley. So we have a very serious event here. Now, after this, and here we're finishing up soon, after the Hazael conquest and this earthquake, we see a very clear change in the site. And for a brief period, we start seeing material culture which is not Philistine anymore, but Judite. And we can see houses and pottery and figurines and other objects which fit in perfectly with what we would find in Jerusalem at the time, at Lachish at the time, at Judite sites. And what this indicates is that for a brief period of time, this site was taken over by the Judite kingdom, and this fits in perfectly what we know from the Assyrian texts and from the biblical texts, is that Hezekiah, king of Judah, tried to expand westward for a brief period in the late 8th century, and then in a series of 2 campaigns, first by Sargon II, and second by his son Sennacherib, particularly in 701, Hezekiah is pushed back into the core region around Jerusalem, and the site of Gat is destroyed. And in fact, with that, we sort of end the story of the Philistines, except, of course, we have to mention another site. I promised we'd mention another site, so I chose to mention Ashkelon. And of course, Larry Sager, which some of you may remember, once was at the Oriental Institute here, excavator of Ashkelon. And we know that while Gat was destroyed in 830, the other Philistine cities continued to exist. And until 604, when Nebuchadnezzar, the same Nebuchadnezzar that destroys Jerusalem about 20 years later, campaigns to Philistia, destroys the remaining Philistine cities, razes them to the ground, takes all the Philistines and ships them off to Mesopotamia, and deports them. And with that, basically, is the end of the Philistine culture. So you have this period from just after 1200 till just before 600, close to 600 years of a vibrant culture which appears, transforms, develops, and then ends quite suddenly. So let's get back to the original question. So who are the Philistines? So first of all, everybody agrees it appears somewhere after the late Bronze Age, Iron Age transition. And what we now can see, though, is we won't ever be able to find that one place where the Philistines came from, but rather, most probably, it's an amalgamation of peoples that came from various areas in the West and came and settled in Canaan. And when they settled in Canaan, they settled with the Canaanites. We don't see evidence of a destruction of the Canaanite cities, except here and there small parts of cities, but rather, apparently they settled down, and maybe the Philistines became the elites, but they settled with the Canaanites together. And the Philistine culture in itself is a hybrid, entangled culture. It's not, there wasn't somewhere where they acted like Philistines out there in the West, and they just moved it over. But rather, the Philistine culture as we know it is a combination of all these aspects, local and foreign, together. We can see slow change and a lot of cultural, but they retain a cultural identity. And while they were adversaries of the Israelites and the Judites, there was a lot of other things going on. And as we see archaeologically, the Samson story itself is a great example of this. Because Samson, you always think of Samson, he killed the Philistines, he was killed by the Philistines, but he also married a couple of Philistines, visited a Philistine prostitute in Gaza, there were a lot of things going on. There's a very mixed, and again, it doesn't matter whether the story actually occurred or not, but it tells us, someone once defined the Samson story as border fiction. That means it's telling the story of the interactions that went on in the border between the Israelites and the Philistine zones. And that's what we can see archaeologically as well. And the biblical descriptions of the Philistine-Israelite relations, even though we know so much about it, and it seems that there's so much information, but when we start looking at the details, there's a lot that's not there. And a very good example of this is the fact that, according to the biblical text, the Philistines from the 10th century were subservient to the Israelites, and that seems very much not the case. And finally, the Philistines disappear after 604, and it's a complete and total disappearance. And in fact, after 604, you cannot talk of a Philistine culture anymore. And what happened apparently is that the devastation that the Babylonians wrought on Philistia was so complete that there were very few people living in Philistia. And when we see resettlement of Philistia a couple of centuries later, it's with Phoenicians. There are no Philistines there. And the Philistines who were taken to Mesopotamia within 100 years or so assimilated and lost their cultural identity, and there was nobody there who was identified as a Philistine. And of course, everybody always asks me, is there a connection between the Philistines and the Palestinians? Well, the answer, like any good Jewish answer, is yes and no. And the no is, let's start with the no, there is no cultural or genetic connection between the Philistines and the Palestinians. And also, by the way, according to the Palestinian national narrative, they don't want to be Philistines. They want to be Canaanites. But there is a connection, and the connection is quite simple. From the Iron Age, when the Philistines lived in Philistia, the Greeks started reaching this region, and traders, mercenaries, etc. And the region where the Philistines lived was called Philistia. The name of this region was retained, and later on, after the Second Jewish Revolt, the Bar Kokhba Revolt in 132 to 135 CE, as a punishment against the Jews who revolted, Hadrian, the Roman emperor, renamed the entire land of Israel from Judea to Palestina. He took the name of the region of southern coastal plain and renamed the entire region. So that's why anybody who lived in the land of Israel, the southern Levant, from the time of Bar Kokhba until 1948 was called a Palestinian, whether you were Jewish, Arab, or Christian. And in fact, I have many friends who tell me that they can show me their grandparents' identity card from the time of the British Mandate, where it says that they're a Palestinian, even though they're Jews. So the connection between the Palestinians and the Philistines is mainly a geographical connection, just like there is nobody of the Manhattan tribe who lives in Manhattan, but we still call it Manhattan. So what's left is for all of you to join me on the excavation, and in July we'll be out there. And if you want more information, and I blog, I like blogging, so if you want to follow what goes on the excavation and things that are going on during the year, you can look that up. And if you don't come, a berserk Philistine warlord will come after you. Thank you very much.